Welcome to the School of Architecture. As you know, this is part of our commemoration of the school's 50th anniversary. So there are a series of events we're calling Now and Then, which pair presentations by a past and a current faculty member in the school, followed by a moderated discussion, including, we expect all of you here. I will say, in terms of upcoming events, while I'm killing some time, you can check the website. We have Portfolio Day coming up. There's one event not yet on the schedule, which is 3 weeks from today. Stan Allen will give a lecture as part of the Monday night series. Tonight is our second Now and Then, at least our second paired version of that, and so we're very happy to welcome back Ben Nicholson to the school, our neighbor as an associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Ben's now partner for the evening is Ania Jaworska, clinical assistant professor in the school. After opening presentations by Ben and Anja, tonight's discussion will be emceed by Thomas Kelly, TK, over here. Ben's first stint of duty, as his slide shows, in the school was in the late 80s, 89 through the early 90s, when he was hired by Stanley Tigerman, right around the time that Ben's Appliance House book came out. He made a brief return, I believe, in the mid-90s under different circumstances, while he was also a studio professor at IIT, and at that time was working on the Loaf House and the Unthinkable House. In terms of the discussions, as we said last time, there's not a secret or necessary connection or conspiracy between the discussants. It's really an arranged marriage on our part, so it's totally our responsibility. That said, there is some rationale for the pairing tonight. Both Ben and Anja are emigres and graduates of Cranbrook. Both are collectors and typologists of unusual objects, bread tags and guns for the one, corporate logos for the other. Both played the role of graphic essayist in Flat Out, dealing with such emblematic subject matter as columns and labyrinths. And both have practices that activate the uncanny or hidden aspects of more everyday appearances of architecture and its elements, moving easily, you could say, between construction and exhibition cultures. As part of this series is really about lines of genealogy and influence, we're interested in how ideas migrate from one place to another or one time to another, and we have a hunch that there are such lines existing between Ben and Anja. I would leave it at that, except this summer I was very fortunate and lucky enough to go down to New Harmony for the first time, which is a weird place. For me, anyway. But I was able to sort of firsthand see Ben's sort of earth drawings, which you might call labyrinths, which were really amazing in his backyard. There seems to be a culture of them down there. But soon after visiting Ben down in New Harmony, I was reading an article in one of the serious architectural journals about Jeff Bridges. It turns out that Jeff Bridges is also an aficionado and maker of labyrinths and mazes in his backyard. And he says he kind of dances through them and does whatever. Yes, believe it or not, the Big Lebowski and Ben Nicholson have the same project going on in their backyard. So I've always suspected that Ben has somehow been able to survive all the style changes and ideological changes in architecture over the last 30 years. But now I can actually say the Ben abides. So don't call him the dude, though. You may get in trouble. I will let Thomas sort of lay out the evening and the participants. But I just want to thank all three in advance. And again, after the exchange, I hope we can all be part of the discussion. So Ben, Anja, Thomas, thank you.
And thank you, Ben and Anja, for joining us, myself, and the UIC audience and Chicago at large audience tonight. To introduce our audience to the format, we will begin with approximately a 20-minute presentation by Ben Nicholson, followed by a 10-minute presentation by Ania Jaworska, and then we will meet, discuss, and open up the conversation to questions. I think a big part of this is to, I guess, straddle two different time periods that were kind of integral to our discussants, but also important to our audience. I think a couple of the subjects I'd like to cover over the course of the evening will involve small towns. Ben, as you know, as Bob discussed, is from New Harmony. Anja is from, and I'm hoping I'm going to get this right, Stary Sącz.
Perfect.
From Poland, a slightly larger small town, 10,000. Obviously, Bob mentioned the pedagogical parallels. Both of them obviously taught at UIC. You know, Anja continues to teach here. And both were at Cranbrook at very interesting but different times. Parallels are to be drawn there. And then when it comes to the work, I think when we look at Ben Nicholson's work, there is maybe a superficial reading of a kind of postmodern aesthetic through the lens of antiquity. And if we were to, again, do a similarly superficial read of Ania Jaworska's work, there is a close read of postmodernism that yields a sense of contemporaneity that I think would be interesting to discuss as it relates to the direction of the school moving forward. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ben to take the podium and introduce us to some of his work. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks a lot for the introductions. As always, it's great to be here. I feel as if I'm employed here, but Jonathan Solomon is paying for the privilege. It's nice to be back home. I would like to go on a rip-roaring journey, not so much a lecture as a place to settle on a few spots and then move on a little bit fast. This is a super early project, actually done whilst being a student. And the project has now actually come out of its box again and is being exhibited here and there. This is a palindromic urinator, a man pissing on his neck. This is the 1970s. Johnny Rotten, all of that stuff was going on. And at that time, I learned how to draw. All of those curvaceous forms that we know so much, I had to struggle with axonometric, very difficult. For this lecture, I thought, okay, better go to collage. So I put in Ben Nicholson collage. Of course, I've lost all of my own images. And then I find myself surrounded by Ben Nicholson, who was the great collagist, my great uncle's son. So, and then I found that there was a student who'd been doing Ben Nicholson collages right next to a Ben Nicholson collage. So we have here 3 recursions of the dreaded word collage. This I did whilst teaching here with Julie, who's in the audience, and Dan. Thank you, Mark Webber, who was a student at that time. And my particular practice of collage was really an interstitial knitting process. The craft was Cranbrookian, brutally rigorous, and really I was looking for a fission of space within the bas-relief of paper. We then, with Mark's help, went and built this damn thing, and the taboo is always interesting to me, so it was made out of mahogany. I wanted rare wood. Mark has just 2 years ago, he refused to cut a 12.5-foot long piece of mahogany that was 32 inches wide. And I will always love him and never forget that he would not do that. So apparently he's just cut it, but on we go. So this project is about making something that untangles out of a series of drawings at the Renaissance Society. And the task here, this was all done in this space, by the way. That's correct. And it was erected here, and it stayed up for a number of months. Another passion of mine is collecting. And in this drawer is my bread tag collection, superseded only by Dan and Julie Wheeler's hose nozzle collection. And I want to give this sense in this talk that design work, the ever-present right now weird curiosity work, and then a kind of delving into the past all work together. This piece is about the B-52 bomber. These are fragments from bombers. And it was really a desire to see collage as it exists in the landscape in readiness. And out of that came this house, the loaf house, that was actually going to be a design build project, believe it or not, but it didn't do that. You can understand why. So I actually did my last collage in 1989. I haven't done it since, but that quality of interstitial spaces and sewing things together, really patching, found its life in this project. Down in the IIT, I worked with Michelangelo, not the pretender to the throne, but the real thing, and worked on the Laurentian Library and picked up my passion for geometry, which has never gone away. There's a pavement in that building. I'm not going to go into it, but it is, in my opinion, the lost treatise of Mannerist number theory that I believe Michelangelo worked on, and it was covered over, still is, for many centuries. So my form of, dare I say, theoretical research is to actually get down on your knees and start making frottage rubbings and then measure them. All of this work happened in this school. Working on this project, I got into trouble because actually I realized I didn't know diddly squat about geometry. So I then began to look at the books that were in the library in 1589, annotated the collections, and then really got a little bit more serious. I began to read certain documents. This is the Hesiod's Theogony. And I was thinking that perhaps these great texts had a number structure, a geometric structure upon which the text hung. And so I would make these very, very careful drawings of what that grouping and how the series of names and gods and goodness knows what, how they interconnected. And then, of course, Zeus, naughty boy, Zeus, who was quite happy shagging his great aunt as he was somebody else, they had this sort of similar fusion of creative spark that we don't want to know about. This required some hardcore drawing. It was done both by my assistant, Sari Hassano, and then I would draw all of these things by hand. Now, this was all happening whilst UIC was pretending that it was working on geometry with Greg Lynn, actually, who claimed he always wanted to learn about geometry. Well, I actually was learning about geometry. And I realized at that time, I was gardening, I love to garden, I was looking at my apple tree, pruning it and so forth, and I realized that the apple tree has three forms of geometry, all that happen at the same time. It has the pentagon of the seed pods, and therefore the flowers. It has a spiral as the nubs go up each branch, and then it has a fractal leaf pattern. And I realized at that time that people who say, I do geometry, might be Euclidean geometry, or it might be, I don't know, Gaspard Monge descriptive geometry. To focus on a single form of organizing the world is really stupid. and it creates all sorts of problems. And I would say, actually, that one of the difficulties and tragedies of the bendy architecture has been a lack of understanding of how all of these forms of seeing the world interconnect, that they are not singular moments. This is on 90 Mile Beach in Australia, where my wife and I go. This is Squeaky Beach, another great beach. Fantastic drawing tables. And of course, if you read through the Greeks, that's where they did their teaching of geometry. I would do it with my students up on Montrose, which has got pretty good sand. Wherever I am in the world, if I don't have the language, we just sit down and start drawing, and this was a pretty wonderful time with Samburu tribesmen. Okay, so geometry, design, rampancy, reduction, these are all themes that I like to work on, and particularly journey making. I'm not Muslim. Of course, there is always the Muslim within us, but I felt that it was necessary to really understand the Islamic Hajj. So I read all of the accounts, not the pictures, but the accounts. And in my sketchbook, drew the whole sequence and realized that human beings actually draw us a line. It's as if we have a piece of thread out of our butt, and we just go around with this thread and form this single line. We may think that we're in New York and Chicago at the same time. Actually, that doesn't happen. It's a single line. So I then began to think about having done the loaf house, which was super noisy, super messy, to pull it down a little bit and get into what I call the first architectural plan, which is going from A to B. That's our job. We go from A to B. And architecture is about how you go to A to B the long way round. So obviously, the first architectural plan, in my opinion, was always, and really still is, the labyrinth. And so I spent a decade drawing every labyrinth that's published, then began in this series to develop a new typology, new taxonomy, but it was always about the single line. And this was happening when Ben van Berkel, is that his name? Right, yeah, was working on the bendy buildings. And I just looked at them with fascination and wondering what little has changed and what little can change. These are all drawn by hand and colored with, as you can see, with pencil, so forth. And there's a lot of them, a couple of hundred. There comes a moment when you're working that you, what I call, reach a white heat of acknowledgement that you got there. These are these two drawings. They are noisy drawings, but they have, the tools they use are simple notes. So this drawing and this drawing are the same drawing for me. It is one whereby the passion of figuration and the lack of understanding of reduction finds its way. So this drawing and this drawing and this drawing, it's exactly the same place, no different. And then, of course, when you start walking, as we do in the countryside, down the line, you have these labyrinths and these lines in your head. And so I set up a drawing table 40 foot wide in my cabin, and then had the labyrinths committed to memory, and then would walk them out. So this experience of having these things in you all the time is very important to me. Tiling, super important. These were done at IIT now 10 years ago. Once again, these are made out of blocks. This wall is made out of blocks. On the left is a line, and on the right is a double spiral serif. And so this idea of going from points to lines just through the way something is arranged is important. Inevitably, swastikas come up when you work with geometry. If you travel in the world, swastikas come up. You see at Amritsar, the culture up there work with swastikas, so I decided to get involved with taboo. I still am involved with taboo. Gaspard Monge, the great geometer, is also in this project, and he was involved with artillery and making the line that forms an arch that goes from A to B as a parabola. So this idea that designers often double as military historians and military thinkers, geometers. Both Leonardo and Michelangelo were both involved in military design. And so we have here Gaspard Monge, whom you all probably know. And if you don't know, you will have that in your blood with the kinds of work that we do today. You just can't separate it. War and peace, geometry, thought, lines, arches, it's all part of the same thing. And if we refuse to acknowledge this, then we live in a not so rich world. As a side journey, I decided to get into America's gun culture and try to figure out what's going on. This is some recreational shooting, 2 to 3 million rounds fired over a weekend by a bunch of surgeons, believe it or not, and good old boys. It's a machine gun shoot. You simply have to go there. If you are, especially if you're from out of the country, just go. It's $10 to get in. It's fantastic. This is the Big Sandy machine gun shoot, and I was watching this guy fire like a mile away and realized that this is the line, right? This is the great line. This is the architectural line of a very fast bullet doing everything it can to break the parabola. And so I've been involved with marksmanship a little bit and bought a Russian sniper rifle, and I'm having a pretty interesting time of going very fast and very slow. And at the same time, taking apart firearms. And then, of course, a friend of mine said, well, of course you would. You're the appliance house guy. You like to find out what's inside things. And so I've got this is not one of mine, unfortunately, this kind of real fascination about what's inside and what's outside, what the mechanics of something are and what are not. A couple of 303 SMLE Lee Enfield rifles. What's on the outside, what's on the inside. So all of that early collage work, all of those early drawings about the skin and then what's inside has always been fascinating to me and still is. Now, I collect ammunition, have quite a reasonable collection, and here we have the marriage, the great marriage of the straight line and the curve. If you look at that white lead oxide, of course, round of ammunition with the white bullet, that is a prayerful moment in the history of design, because it is a minimalist form, incredible engineering to get to that point. So that earlier project of trying to reconcile the figurative and the imaginary and the abstract has always been of interest. I teach firearm design at the Art Institute and more recently at Cornell. This is the lecture poster for the course. We get into all sorts of things, a lot of deep research, patent design. Here's a self-explanatory model. And then that funny bone in me, I have a good relationship with the cops in Chicago, and then the forensics department and our group of students, we teach each other stuff. And the cops came down to the Art Institute, and the curator was really interested in armor, still is, and so he kitted up a cop in genuine 1550 armor and said, let's have a fight in order to figure out what's good about contemporary armor and what's good about medieval. It was really fascinating. But of course, the real love is the irony of it, the humor of it, and the ridiculousness of it. This sort of question is very, very interesting to me, of dealing with the ridiculous. This is part of a political satire I wrote about solving the world's crisis by rebuilding Jerusalem and spending $1 trillion on the building rather than the regular $1 million. And everybody gets what they want. This is a dating T-shirt, and boys are on the left, girls are on the right, and you color code according to what's going on each year or month. This is another part. This is written just after 9/11, and I was interested, still am interested, in America's crazy upside-down culture, and this was, in many respects, spoke about what was happening today, of the dirty old men in the front, and then the hashtag movement of saying enough. Okay, so I'm also working on, finished a satire on Donald Trump and Hillary, and produced some materials, and then to end it all is the great gift that the UIC has made for me to build that satire in Calamity News. Okay, thank you very much.
So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this series, and opportunity to research and learn about your work and from your work, Ben, and engage with it. It is an honor to be able to also introduce my work to you and to the audience, and be in conversation and establish parallels and differences. And I would like to use this opportunity as an introduction of my work to you, Ben. And as part of this presentation, I wanted to focus on two recently completed projects that in turn inform my work that I'm currently developing. And as an introduction, I want to maybe briefly talk about what my work is about. I often use simplistic forms, humor, commentary, and bring conceptual and cultural references to my work. And through drawings, installations, sculpture, proposals, I explore architecture, its history, its form, function, and concepts. Architecture is, to me, a form of research, inquiry, a development of work, and the work I produce functions as proposals or larger studies for works, but also stand as independent final works. And I like to think that my work is simple and complex, funny and serious, and familiar and unfamiliar in the same time. So I wanted to start with kind of trying to think about a flat out, or introduction with a flat out, as we're both graphic essayists, and which is kind of a first parallel. And I have been aware of your extensive work that explores and classifies labyrinths for some time. And I've learned just recently how multi-level that work is. And I'm very interested in the fact that you investigated complex organisms and geometries through extensive and time-consuming process of drawing, but also a minimum kind of means to express the most complex ideas, and also finding a way to synthesize those complex ideas. I'm also very interested and impressed by the fact that the labyrinths use minimum amount of means to address space, a journey, and then there is a level of interaction with the work with self, an experience of exploring it, but also socially engaging with other people, students, and also developing the basic system to produce the work. The minimum means necessary to produce a large body of work, extensive body of work, whether a piece of paper and a pencil or rake and leaves. And this kind of amount of work and experimentation that offers complete catalog taxonomy. So I hold similar interests, and I wanted to talk about the work I produced, which was also featured in Flat Out, a subjective catalog of columns, which is an ongoing investigation, precise but an incomplete, and not so systematic inquiry in form, history, and meaning. So I really wanted to introduce this work, which was showcased as a part of a solo exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago as part of Chicago Work Series. And subjective catalog of columns is this collection of images depicting an architectural column as an isolated element that carries references and narratives. The column is used for its inherent symbolic qualities present within architectural history and popular culture. So I established that an architectural column's role ranges from structural support to decorative element, universal icon, or the carrier of a specific message that has been continuously manipulated throughout the history of architecture. In the subjective catalog of columns, this element as a symbol is appropriated and extended. And drawings of the selected examples are paired with a supporting narrative in order to serve as an investigation tool of popular culture, architectural discourse, practice, and further applying meaning and commentary to this isolated form. So you will find in the catalog the catalog showcases and reconfigures instances that reference architectural history or proposed future innovations. It pairs technological advancements along traditional methods and sophisticated concepts with vernacular. And some seek to expose matters present within the architectural arena, and other elevate everyday expressions. So I wanted to give a little bit of sampler. So the image here shows two sticks tied together, an original column, a precedent. And the two images here, I was kind of following Alberti's statement that the principal ornament in our architecture lies in a column. And so the left image depicts decorative Greek Ionic column. The image is titled Faking It. The classical form of the Greek columns persisted and are continuously reused in Western architecture. And depending on the context in which order or which order is reused, they represent stability, tradition, authority, status, wealth, knowledge, and justice. And they are also expressions of taste and style. And so a classical column, whether a structural or decorative element, lends prestige and legitimacy to the building and its owners. And oftentimes the depiction itself, independent of the structure and materiality, carries the references and powerful messages. And then so decorative columns apply to exterior and interior elevations of buildings, pretend importance, like in the image on the left. And on the right is a pretty porch, kind of an everyday expression of vernacular, good-hearted expression of a home. The catalog also showcases and reconfigures instances that reference architectural history. So on the left is an elevated icon that alludes to Mies van der Rohe. It's titled Saint. On the right is an image titled Wooden Column on Fire. It was always burning, and the drawing references the stout column with a simplified yet oversized capital that was designed by Robert Venturi and Dennis Scott Brown in the Allen Memorial Museum edition. And the cladding references 70s wooden basement paneling. And the architects actually claim that this is the first example of a historical reference in architecture in the last half of a century at that time. Another example is that both of those columns are open for interpretation. They suggest a mistake, an illusion, an architectural joke. On the left is a drawing that can be read either as an isometric or front and back elevations of a round or a completely flat column. You can decide which is right. And on the right side, whoops, this column supports nothing. It produces a shadow. I don't know if it's visible, but it actually spells ha 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 ha. And so it is an architectural gesture that is used by architects like Philip Johnson or Peter Eisenman. And of course, the catalog references postmodern architects who adapted and redefined the classical column, which no longer functioned as a structural support, but extravagant decorative element that generated ironic declarations and narratives. That formal, material, and aesthetic manipulations define a position towards the past and recent history, pop culture and architectural discourse at large, and in addition, sometimes became personal statements and puns. Catalog also features references to Chicago, specific to Chicago. On the left side is a column that you can find on Lakewood Avenue. Of course, it's taken out of the context of the building. And on the right side is a riddle that really probably only decipherable by architects and enthusiasts familiar with work of Stanley Teichmann. The other serious matters are explored in the catalog, like this image called "It Is Not Easy," that is kind of this curvy red shape, suggests the silhouette of female body, and brings to attention the fact that architecture is not easy for women and men, but also it is kind of an optimistic time for all of us right now. I also look into technological advancements, like this field of slanted columns in random configurations, reminiscence of architectural moves used by Rem Koolhaas, Will Alsop, Zaha Hadid. And this image that depicts a structural system of Slaven House by Greg Lynn. So as you may know, that Slaven House is a proposal in which the structure, its beams and columns, form a continuous Calvinier steel tube that weaves and loops throughout space, intersecting and touching. So this is this kind of wow idea depicted in the poster. And I was very trying to be as true as possible to the form of the structural system. And in this long line, the left one is my prediction of the future, and the right one is kind of a modernized version of a Solomonic column, still both impassable in terms of technology. And so the project finds its culmination in the grant proposal for column pavilion, which is very, very loosely references Greek Parthenon. A pitch roof is supported by the assembly of the varied conflicting conditions of the column. The depicted columns in the catalog appear unassuming, yet after careful investigation offer complex dialogues. And some are familiar forms to all, and some allusions require an insider's recognition. The reading is dependent on the audience, which is based on their shared knowledge, background, point of view, and taste. And for the use of humor, the catalog functions as both praise and critique, making equal the varied conditions represented in this series. And this idea of a column is, as a flat symbol, is also explored within the same exhibition, but second kind of part of the exhibition, which is this environment with black walls, plush carpet, and black installation. And so those two thin columns, again, do not support anything. They're actually, in fact, supported by sandbags. And in front is a piece called Gated Area, and is composed of the semicircular arch entrance and a horizontal circular boundary traveling through space in the form of a line and producing an ambiguous boundary. And again, this is kind of an investigation and maybe the most two common elements of architecture, and also thinking about arch as this kind of form that is used as a structure and symbol as well. So of course the form no longer needs to rely on the material, And it is the kind of arch entrances fill our everyday, like, you know, garden pergolas and even golden arches of McDonald's. But regardless of size, I argue that Arch Gateway sends a message of significance and requires that we acknowledge its prominence. In this case, the arch is reduced to the minimum, very little, and it still communicates a grandiose entrance. The structure is elevated exactly 10 inches above the ground in order to produce a boundary, enough to acknowledge it's in space, do not tip over, but also enough for a person to be able to step over it. It is mostly a visual and psychological boundary, and physically it is really not challenging, but it is enough to keep us in or out of the space. And I think it was my ambition to mark the space with kind of minimum means, but minimum possible means, with just one line traveling through space, and maybe perhaps similar to explorations of labyrinths formed on the beach with your students. I'm also interested in signage as part of built environment and architecture. So the sculpture on the right spells high. It is a very direct salutation and message. It is called Monument for Them. And the left one is here, rotating sign, which is a landmark, and which kind of recalls commercial signage. It also explores the notions that people project their basic desire for recognition onto built structures. And not surprisingly, the sign was very popular in the space. People actually came in and photographed themselves and posted on Instagram the photo with the hashtag here to make sure that everybody knows they were there. So it actually was very successful in that way. I'm interested in kind of this idea of a signage and an idea kind of further translates to kind of extensive use of the classical column and logos of institutions and companies wanting to appear as reliable, prominent, or classy. I've been interested in this, you know, architectural element becoming part of popular culture and started collecting logos that depict a classical column. So here is a little sampler of possibilities of combinations and adaptations, which are endless. As a graphic icon, it's kind of an equalizer of taste. Again, a cliche symbol that is, you know, that is kind of loaded, culturally loaded, but also bankrupt. And as a logo serves from, you know, world-class universities to small-town construction companies, or even dentists, which is on the right. You can see a tooth with the Ionic capital combined together in the form of a logo. So it is really inclusive, always available, and as a result, unpredictable in its allegiance and partnering equal with dentists, restaurants, and institutions like universities, banks, and furniture warehouses. I'm pairing, this is something that I'm working on, I'm pairing the logos with additional commentary in order to showcase and expose that overused and tired icon, and perhaps maybe even compile an entire alphabet. So included in the flat out is also a depiction of this overused and tired icon that awaits new developments. So I think I will conclude my presentation. I realized I went over time a little bit. I had another project that I wanted to showcase, and I think I'm going to just go quickly through it. And maybe perhaps only wanted to mention that it doesn't directly relate to your project, but it was also built here at UIC with students. So it is set. It is a series of furniture that kind of redefine function and typology of furniture and obscure the clarity of the object and the relationship it has with the person, with the space, and other objects in the space. So set functions as the kind of set of objects, set as a stage for interactions and behaviors, and set as a kind of collection of objects. And that redefine the typology. So these are two coffee tables, which in fact have vertical pegs in which you can organize objects in between, but also Some of them are big enough to place a cup on top of them. A large armchair, which is hard, very imposing. When you sit in it, you really gain an authoritative pose. Table, just for 4 people, that excludes, excludes sides to be used. It's narrow, so people actually become very, very close in close direction to each other, and need to move their objects to the sides. And a credenza, which is, has this kind of left and right cylinders that imply separation. It is also placed on this elevated platform that is a little bit oversized, assuring that it doesn't really touch the wall, and can be placed in the middle of the space. And some other aspect of this project was tested within the exhibition. One might think about, what this imposing form can store, and also doubles as a room divider. So these are the 2 projects or body of works that represent my architectural inquiry, but through drawings and objects. Something I'm interested in exploring further, something that allows for generating and testing ideas, as well as receiving feedback. So I'm interested in the fact that you explore architectural ideas for a range of media, scales, systems, inquiries, and I'm looking forward to discussing the parallels and differences.
Great, thank you, Anja, thank you, Ben. And I think we will jump right into it. I think there are many points of departure, and I'd still like to allow for time for the audience to be able to respond. But I do think it's important to, again, remind the audience that though there are kind of obvious parallels, I think certainly with the way both of you treat drawing as anyways, kind of a primitive form of architectural communication. One of the earliest parallels, and this has to do with my obsession just with origin stories, would be each of your time spent at Cranbrook, which I would presume was maybe your first engagement with the Midwest, and at very different times. And so to give the audience some context, Ben would have attended Cranbrook at the time in which the director was Daniel Libeskind, and Anja would have attended Cranbrook at the time when Jonathan Massey? Bill Massey, excuse me. William Massey.
Just 2 Masseys.
Right. Yeah, not Jonathan, he's in a different part of Michigan. Will Massey would have been the director. And I'm interested, if it's okay, to go back to that time to understand what lessons were learned, maybe specifically relating to oftentimes a divisive point in architecture, which is maybe the distinction between drawing and making, and whether your time there had an impact that could be kind of classified as one or the other.
Well, when I was there were no computers. They didn't exist. So you simply had to draw if you were to visualize something prior to committing the knife and the screwdriver. So I would say that there's that sea change where projects were being done in anticipation of a technology that we knew would be our own downfall. There was a rush to place the last piece of lead on the paper. And so I think that there was a frenzy of drawing in the era that I was there, where we didn't know it precisely, but we knew that the end, it's like being in America now, the empire's finished, the Chinese have arrived. It's like, what do we do now? Like, what will this country and its architecture do now, except for perhaps have this lament that we both share through this kind of mild rampage through the good old days of the architecture that certainly Bob advocates and those periods beforehand. So I mean, that would be my immediate response, is that there was a frenetic desperation that this was it. And we had to do something about it. Now, in my personal case, I really tried hard to do computers, but I didn't like the noise of the fans. Because when I drew, I need to listen to the pencil going through the paper. I need to see the way that the pencil cuts a small channel in the paper. With my geometry drawings, if you turn them upside down, they don't work. Because the blade of the pencil is related to the shadow that comes in off the light. So you're drawing to the shadow and the depth. No, you can't do that in architecture. And I thought, let someone else do it. I'll stick with the pencil and run this fish out till the end game.
You mentioned when you were presenting that collage was a Cranbrookian.
A Cranbrookian activity. Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, the method, look, collage has got a long history, very long history. And as I wrote about in the Appliance House book, we still do collage. It's just a question of bringing things together that don't actually belong in each other's realm. That's been going on since time immemorial. So when you look at Michelangelo, the real one, the paintings and the drawings, he's drawing an arm and drawing an egg and an ear, and it just smooshes them all together. We always do that. And actually, this is something that I would really like to ask yourself. What happens when you start putting things together? Because when I look at the work, there is this singularity to the object, an adoration of the object, and that dirty moment when all hell breaks loose by not knowing how things go together. Yeah. That was a collage project. Is really taking Maldero's. I mean, we would just read that phrase over and over and over again, of the bicycle and the typewriter falling in love, making love on the ironing board. I mean, that was the task, is to reenact the Dictaean cave. I think it's Dictaean. No, it's not Dictaean. It's the Delphic cave, where the oracle it works with peasants who are chewing drug-infested laurel leaves and making pronouncements. That's what we wanted. We wanted the spatial pronouncement of the intersection of unlike objects. It was a religious activity, but done through secular means.
Anja, did you feel like similar secular activities were happening while you were at Cranbrook?
Well, I think that maybe I was there in a different time, right? So there was a push definitely to experiment with materials and to build.
Yeah.
I think that the drawing was present.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily explored to the level that that was explored when you were there. So we were encouraged to make, to build, to test materials and learn from that.
Yeah.
In order to, I guess, one, to know what it takes to build, to learn from it in kind of learn from a physical object, yes, to test it out. And then, of course, there will be recording of it. I think that, as you might know, and I think that it was definitely very self-directed, right, and very specific to individual personality or person and their inquiry. So some people would go very ambitious and build, but actually others would still explore drawing and collage as well.
Right.
So.
I mean, that making, I would say, did not happen at Cranbrook. However, it did happen in this building, as Mark will attest to, and who worked on the Tellerman cover. In fact, he basically led that team. And the directive, if there was such a thing, and there was that there were to be no screws used, no nails used, basically no glue used. It all had to be held together with wedges. the entire structure was dangerous. So that the vision was that how can we make something that is constantly on the edge of falling apart? We designed it so that its balance was super precarious, and that it felt like it was tipping. It didn't tip, but it could have tipped, and so that the kind of that experience that we had at Cranbrook of this kind of dangerous reanalysis of all of those crazy guys, the early collages, not the bespoke ones like Juan Gris. It was the bad boys. It was the Schomp family and the Kurt Schwitters, all of the bad collages. Because, Richard Meyer was bespoke collage, but Libeskind was not. So I guess what happened in this building was that we made the vision that we didn't know how it actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
That was our making.
But presumably, I mean, based on your talk and based on what I know about, I think your chronology, it seems like your time at UIC also coincided with a big, transition. I mean, you might call it a hinge moment.
Yeah.
In which you abandon the collage right around the time you publish the Appliance House book with MIT Press. And so I think, let's quickly fast forward, we don't have all night, to your time at UIC, in which I think, Anja, that would have been 2011, presumably, and then around the time, this kind of critical time at which the collage ceases to, be a mode of representation that could, yield the kind of architectural conversation you were interested in having.
Right. So what's the question?
So I guess at the end of the day, your experience here at UIC and your cohort shifts from, at the time at Cranbrook, being around people like Jesse Reiser, Hani Rashid, and Daniel Libeskind, to a different cohort who is beginning to experiment with geometry and the computer in a different way.
Well, look, when I was a student in London doing the palindromic urinator, Stanley Tigerman, I was introduced to his hot dog house, and I thought, whoa, that's very, very good. And so I wanted to I wanted to meet that man, and it was really fortunate that the introductions were made. And so it was it was really a projective coming home to be with someone who intrinsically did that stuff all day long. And it was fabulous because the support was there. Like the ideas, he got the ideas. He saw that I wasn't really into the Libeskind deconstruction thing. That was not my sort of thing. I was much more into the goofy and the comic and the comedic. That was really where I still am. Where my interests lay.
And I think that's another parallel, I think, with Anja's project, maybe slightly more deadpan, but how I think humor is also something that tends to align a lot of interests here at UIC. It's kind of a recurring theme we hear.
Right. I mean, look, we have to come to terms with the fact that this is a school that is in homage to Stanley. And the tragedy of it is that here is the man who destroyed Mies. And yet, he has become the new Miesian because he's got so many followers that he doesn't want to murder. And so what I'm interested in is how you murder your father. Like, what do you need to do? So for my work, I murdered collage in order to go someplace. Maybe in the last 30 years it didn't happen. I don't know. Maybe it was a big mistake. But I would say that your generation, my generation, Stanley's generation, we have this very, very strong link, and I would say it needs to be assassinated.
I think Stanley is also asking for that.
But also be interesting, Anja, to hear, your perspective again. I know that Stanley Tigerman's work has a big influence on you, and whether, killing him is of any interest to you.
Well, what means would you use?
Well, I think that I would not kill him, definitely. I think that what is interesting actually to me about
In a
coming
Shakespearean
to
way,
Chicago,
not in a real,
Sure.
not real.
I think Stanley actually Tagman is extension of my previous experiences from Cracow University of Technology,
Yeah.
where I actually studied under postmodern architect for a few semesters. Actually, I made a choice that then interestingly translates into kind of there's a parallel between my time in Poland and then our time at UIC. So I think that. It is kind of an interesting comparison for me, and also thinking about humor. Let's say, and humor in architecture and postmodern architecture, kind of symbolisms and references.
Yeah.
I'm interested also in thinking about how cultures maybe affect or situations or the kind of situations. Political situations, I guess, influence that, and kind of how that maybe I have an understanding of postmodernism through the lens, kind of third hand almost that I've learned in Poland about what's happening in here, and also translate into this very, I don't know, it was a very, the studio I took was very much so about, it was very poetic, if I can say that. And then coming here and learning about the humor and also maybe even the kind of the deadpan or sarcasm in many cases. I thought it was interesting to me to be kind of present within architecture.
May I ask?
Yeah.
How look? This humor is a pretty complicated subject.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
it does not translate very well.
It does
all.
not.
Do you find it easy to laugh in America?
Well, yes, sometimes.
I mean, what is that beautiful space of raised eyebrow and being able to turn something on its end so that everybody understands it, but it didn't need to be said?
Well, one thing is
Because
that
that's the
humor
market.
is so much better here than in Poland.
Better?
Actually, yes, I think so.
All right.
Also, it's different, but I think, yeah.
Well, I think maybe it's
But I don't know about England.
Could I just say
Sure,
one
sure.
last thing on this? There's for humans, we have what we call space. I'm sorry, love. Love. There's like this thing, like everybody tries to describe it, and you can't. Architecture, we've got the same word, it's called space. There is a similar word to love and space, which I would say is humor. It's this like weird place whereby everything is rational, is understood to require being challenged and turned upside down without anybody knowing it until a little bit too late. And that's the delivered line, right? Timing. So there's love, there's space, and there's the timing of the joke. And I think that as architects, we have a real love of that strange, woolly, peculiar place that is undescribable.
certainly, I think Stanley has a mastery over that triptych, and that was something that, I think this school continues to glean from.
Definitely.
I think another thing that, to maybe use Stanley as a point of departure is thinking about architecture as as casting a very wide net. And what I mean by that is, looking at, both of your works, in many ways it is, architecture in anticipation, or I guess, post-anticipation of building. And through Stanley, I think there is a desire to think of architecture as a means of scholarship that taps into a lot of different disciplines. And something that I know, Ben, you wanted to discuss today was this notion of retro scholarship, and essentially what it means to dive deep into any number of subjects, be them guns or political satire, what have you.
Right. Yeah, Bob, we were basically speaking a little bit too early today, and we were talking about how it's scholarship. Is there a retro form of scholarship? Could you study something as if you were in the 1980s? Or study something like, could you study in the manner of the 1980s? I mean, we're doing this with design right now, like studying columns, like this, like that. Does the same thing happen? I mean, I find myself either stuck in a groove or actually deliberately examining a way of scholarship that was conducted 40 years ago. And I just wonder whether it would help the theorizing of our own discipline if we attacked the I guess it's the methodology of scholarship and started to study as if we were in another era and see what would happen. Because I think it's just presumed that it doesn't happen. Now, I guess, I don't know, I'm not the brainy one here.
Well, I think it would be interesting. It's certainly something that is, even since the most recent biennial, kind of this notion of, putting ourselves in the shoes of the past in order to move forward. It kind of goes without saying that's kind of zeitgeisty at the moment, but in many ways, I guess I'm curious to hear about, how can we jump from scholarship to maybe research? I think in both of your practices, taxonomy and, heavy research into sometimes, fairly specific topics, overly specific topics, yields interesting returns or sometimes just yield returns. And I guess I'm curious about research scholarship and how it lends itself to precision, craft, and production of work in both of your lives.
I'm an inveterate collector. And all of us collectors, and you have one of the great collectors on the faculty here, Dan Wheeler,
Mr. Wheeler,
who has a brilliant sense of analysis of certain forms that I'm sure have been enormously important to his practice. In fact, I know it has. So, there's kind of scholarship for designers which ain't the same for the scholarship of the person with texts. I think, as a friend of mine, Neil Spiller, he calls himself a hackademic. Not an academic, but a hackademic. Quite happy just to go stripping through the bush, not interested in the footnotes, and he gets there. I think that the academic scholar as designer collector, whatever that word is important for us. There was the era of making, which is basically over, and now it's the digital age. In other words, the manufacturing age is sort of done. We're now, so it's no surprise that we all are fascinated by objects and what they mean and how design sensibility happens. I think for us designers, what's really good about having collections of objects is you can watch prototype unfold. We don't design by prototype anymore. You don't have something and then whack it so many times to see if it works. I mean, maybe with drawings like let's put the toilet here and let's put the toilet there, but in the end we don't have a prototyping attitude towards technology, which is why I'm so fascinated by the Colt 1911 semi-automatic handgun, because it took 10 years to get to this extraordinary place where aesthetically it is absolutely unimpeachable as a designed object.
Well, here's where it'd be interesting to maybe shift your kind of gaze from guns to columns.
Yeah,
and
same thing, of course.
Sure. And in Anya's case, whether it would be possible, I look at her drawings as a form of prototyping, research through drawing that will eventually kind of yield something, maybe not a column per se, but what are your thoughts about it as an architectural process?
Of what?
In anticipation of building.
Of prototyping?
Sure. Or just the act of kind of researching a taxonomy. researching through taxonomy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm old-fashioned in this, but I actually believe in pushing through the figurative until you get it, and it strips away. And I don't know if that's prototyping or not, but for me, prototyping is taking an idea in a form and drawing it or modeling it, seeing if it works, and it goes through a series of Bush telegraph until it arrives at this sublime moment whereby you have enough of the figurative in it and enough of we didn't need that until it just sits there like a crystal. But this is modernist thinking.
Sure.
You know,
It's both very fast and very slow.
it is. Yeah, it is not new thinking. It's probably more like the postmodernist as a way of doing scholarship, of believing that. You know, it's like I don't have any three-dimensional vision. I'm just making that pronouncement. I got my doctor to sign a form that I have no three-dimensional vision, which I'm really happy. I forgot to photograph it, but how can I be an architect without 3D vision? I have no parallax. I don't see, you know, you're all planes. It's like nobody here has any I don't know what it's like to see something three-dimensional. No idea. So that column thing is kind of complicated for me, because I can't see, you know, I got to imagine it.
I think it's definitely a research, but I just wanted to, so the two-dimensional, because your labyrinths are very two-dimensional, right? But
Sure.
when you start mapping them out, right,
Yeah.
they become very much so spatial,
Right,
three-dimensional,
absolutely.
and you can experience. I wonder how that kind of works with, you know, did hundreds of drawings, right?
Yeah.
And then you did probably a lot of installations of drawing a labyrinth or drawing geometries.
Yeah.
So there's a certain level to that too. I don't know if maybe that's prototyping.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, you just get better at it. I mean, I don't know where you found those photographs, but I would love to have some, because I didn't know anybody was photographing me as I was doing that work. But that leaf work, you know, it's really
Internet.
difficult work. You know, body is stiff as hell. You get good at it. And for those projects, I still am interested in actually nobody seeing them. That you know, it's a super fast version of Goldsworthy. I mean, look, Goldsworthy's in there, let's just face it. Of these ephemeral, chimeral moments of spatial construct. You know, I tell my students when I teach that I am preparing them for a life in a supermax, where you just get 4 walls and a light bulb. And I would like to educate them that they're completely happy for 20 years. That, for me, is what an education is.
Well, on that note, I think before we shift to audience questions, you know, there's I mean, it's not hard to intimate I don't know, a bit of anxiety, maybe angst towards what is sometimes written by you or others as like the Baroque expressionism of the curvy buildings and the maybe premature geometers that you may have encountered during your time of UIC. I guess I'm curious about, Lynn, what is, if maybe the opposite of that would be like a desire for more kind of primitive geometries and kind of simpler logics, like maybe what can our students kind of gain from kind of shifting your attention? Because I would say with both of your works, there seems to be a desire for easy through maybe kind of complex analysis of you know, fairly you know, straightforward geometries.
Maybe I would say essence. I don't know if it's easy or like the kind of reduction.
You know, when you said that, it was like a bolt to the heart, because I'd failed. I mean, drawing a circle is staggeringly difficult thing to do. And I would not say it's about simplicity at all. It's about engaging a mode of practice whereby you're willing to dump the now 64 years of life into a plot and give it to somebody. Now, if it's simple, that's fine. But the task, and that's why I showed those two, the big, like, labyrinths where, oh God, it's so fucking hot, I need to leave the room. That's what I'm interested in, is having the appearance of simplicity, but with a lifetime of warmth, so that you get it. You know, you get both parts of it. I'm not so, I mean, you know, Dan and Julian and I, we are maximalists. You know, we practice minimalism and we practice maximalism. And I think that when you look at their architectural projects and see their collections, you see both happening at the same time. I mean, this is it's about the spirit, and it's about geometry and the pin and the line and all of that, and the messiness. And I want both. And I want anything I do for it to be really apparent that we're not talking about simplicity. We're talking about the largesse of life and love and space and, what was it, the other one? Can't remember now. We were talking about
Humor.
Humor, exactly. Well, the timing, right?
Timing.
Timing. When that coalesces, it's rich. It's a rich moment. And it maybe happens once or twice in your life. Who knows? Could happen every other day. I don't know. But I think that's a Cranbrook thing. That's what we do there, and we don't tell anybody how we do it either.
Except when you're at UIC.
Well, it's, you get what you need. You get what we think you can handle.
Right. I hope it's okay. We don't have too much more time, but I think now might be a good time to ask the audience if they might have any questions. And if you just be patient, in order for us to record it, I will step and hand you a microphone. Any questions for our two discussants? Love, space, timing. If there are no audience questions.
No, there are. It's like, get warm up a little bit here. If anybody's got a really stupid question, please throw it. Because they're always the good ones. Like, if you're embarrassed already before you ask it, that's going to be a good question.
Do we have it? Bob does.
Because I appreciate the idea that you have to, work intensely in order to make it look easy, and that there's a whole series of these things behind. And actually it struck me then your collages, they're not really collages, they're sections. They're like, everything is super serial, linear. Like, even when you're collaging things, it's a kind of drawing. It's not really a collage in the sense that you think of collages. I mean, yes, two irreconcilable things producing a third, but there's always something very anally tight about your collages, which compress and expand in a very serial, linear way. The loaf house, there's deep seriality in the collages that maybe isn't of the day's version of collage, perhaps, but sort of drawing by other means more than it is collage. Yeah. But the question is really about the issue of the labyrinths versus the guns, because the guns, pardon the pun, seem overly loaded as images to begin with, as opposed to the labyrinth, which, through appearing simple, you can produce the heat. But if you start with something that's super hot already, culturally, socially, technically, as an apparatus, like, how do you operate on something like that? Which seems to be the reverse problem of the labyrinth, let's say.
Okay. I'm still in this project, so I don't know how it's going to end up. And I'm beginning to understand what's important about it and what is trivial. What I really like about it is that it takes all of our emotions right to the edge. If this telephone doesn't work, doesn't really matter. With a revolver, it actually does matter. And so to study an object that has been manufactured, relatively simple object compared to a space shuttle, but an object that is whereby the coefficiency of failure is as zero-y as possible, that's an interesting place to go. So in the firearms project, of course there is the whole, blood and gore part of it, which I'm also very, very conscious of. You know, I'm happy to shoot birds and animals and so forth. I know that. But this gun project is really a parable of taking all sorts of mechanical, emotional, political, engineering aspects and taking them, having an object where it describes all of that, which coffee makers don't. I mean, we had a wonderful failure of a coffee maker today in your office. And I thought, you know, if this was a gun, this would not be happening. It wouldn't fail.
But similarly, I think it would be interesting to hear Anya's take as well. I think the two projects that you showed, you know, one incredibly hot, all of the column research, and then the furniture work, which is kind of distilled to a cylinder. And how you know, reconcile those differences between that body of work.
Well, there are definitely both, like the posters and the furniture are definitely reduced and distilled. So then the columns are being taken from the context in order to pair them up so they actually start to engage with each other and start to have maybe apply another meaning to it or context. With the furniture, yeah, I think that was interesting to me to think about what is how to maybe, I don't know, flip things upside down, as you maybe said that too before, with the coffee table, how we are used to typologies in space, how we are used to interacting with the objects and altering the interaction in a very minimal way, but also impacting interaction in space and also behavior around the object. So thinking about, I don't know, the armchair, which is a hard surface. It recalls typologies of many, many armchairs that are usually associated with softness. You know, a place where we can kind of sit and be kind of inside and be comfortable. This chair is comfortable. You can stay in it for a very long time, but the form of it really imposes how you interact with it. You are aware of the materiality, of the finish, of the kind of shininess of the lacquer, and very aware of the geometries and the size. It requires you to sit back, open your arms, and engage within the object. And in turn, you as an occupant of that object start to get a certain attitude, which is mostly kind of like sitting in the front. So it's very authoritative attitude. So it's interesting for me to maybe test that out too. I introduced a cushion, kind of a loose cushion to this object as a kind of means to negotiate the hard surface and the body. And it acts as a comforter almost. It's kind of like a big, loose thing. And it's interesting to see that the object actually changes the experience changes because now you can actually wrap yourself. And now you're inside, but also somewhat removed. In both cases, you're either have a pose with authority, of power, but on the other side, you can be kind of wrapped in, which is also somewhat a powerful thing. I don't know, I think that kind of nuances were very interesting to me, and maybe it's interesting to think about your guns. That work is definitely not about, it's not loaded, but it's interesting to think that you said the marriage of straight line and a curve, and how maybe you're very aware of the idea of how a small object engages with a large space and the speed and the projection, right? I'm also interested in how maybe somewhat nuanced condition can alter our interactions. I don't know.
It almost seems like the adage abides, whereby the cooler the image, the more opportunity is afforded to future meanings.
Okay, well, I mean, related to that kind of coolness, Anja, I'd like to ask about the entranceway made out of a single line. Now, I find that a pretty fascinating object. And I would say that it is, and I'd like to ask you, would you consider it to be an androgynous object or not? Because a column, particularly with the volutes, has always been a phallic object. Always. And the Greeks had a very, very strong understanding of the relationship of certainly sexuality and war, and also within their buildings. You've chosen a column, which is a loaded subject. Did you find that, has this been an issue in the work? I mean, how have you passed it? I mean, I would say that the resolution that you made of that incredible line, which is both pestle and mortar, resolves the problem.
Well, I definitely, with that one, was definitely thinking about the space and the minimum amount of language that I can use in order to mark a space and test behaviors. So the entry and also the line, that kind of a boundary, which both functioned. It was interesting to actually see it in the exhibition space, that perhaps actually people were intimidated by entering, but less intimidated by the lower boundary, obviously. It was interesting too that when you were outside of it, you were really outside. Or you were inside, you were inside. You were aware of the space that the line produced.
Right. Okay.
I think we have time for maybe one last question. That's a short one. Julie Wheeler.
Very much enjoyed listening to you three talking, but I have a question for you two. Could you each tell me something in the built environment that would be termed a building that you admire?
That something that would be turned into a building?
An admirable building.
Well, boy, I could run off a whole bunch. But they're, you know, it's like food. You've got certain appetites at certain parts of the day. I have been really fortunate in my academic career to work in Walter Netsch's building, in Mies van der Rohe's building, in Philip Johnson's House of Education, in a slice of a Georgian square in London, and also in John Haydock's Cooper Union building, and Ilal Saarinen's Cranbrook. And I love all of those buildings. The building, if someone says, what's the best building in the entire world, like bar none, I would probably say Tehran's Casa del Fascio. I think it's a brilliant, funny, technologically crazy, utopian, beautiful puzzle of contradictions. And you know, there's certainly the classical buildings in Athens and so forth. Lalibela in Ethiopia, the buildings made by extraction rather than accumulation are pretty incredible. The rock-cut buildings, they are stunning. They are really hit you in the craw. But these are different meals and different appetites. Some are for the deeply intellectual, some are for the visceral, some are for the emotive. And you know, I really have come to love Maya's New Harmony Athenaeum. I love that building. I really like it. I think it's just a smashing piece of work. Edgy, gutty, all of the above. Mad, absolutely insane building. So once again, it depends on the appetite. And I would say that in response to your question, the issue here is to be flexible internally and know what kind of building you need at a part of your career and also part of the day. It's all of it. But I calculated, I visited Crown Hall 10,000 times in my career. That's a lot. I never got bored there. Never. Same with this building. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happened to it, but the candor of it is still intact. I appreciate that. So, you know, for me, the work of architecture is the invitation to engage in someone's wonderful thought, and also about them admitting that they don't know it all.
How about you, Anja?
Well, I think that similarly, there's probably a lot of buildings that I can think of, but actually you ended with this building, which maybe is something that we all know very well, maybe too well, but we also don't know at all. There's always a question of a journey or a path, maybe going back to your labyrinths. You never have one way to get from point A to point B. You have to actually choose your way.
In this building,
you have to be very aware.
No idea how
you
it
always
works.
have to question your
Right.
way and calculate your way.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is, I don't know, interesting to think about, that this building actually is one of the, maybe not the best examples, but I think an example that can feed into maybe both of our works.
Thanks to Ben Nicholson and Ania Jaworska for their time and insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.